Skylar had always been the epitome of control and order. A 42-year-old marketing executive, she had meticulously crafted her life, career, and home in the upscale neighborhood of Westbridge. Her pristine house stood as a testament to her success, with its manicured lawns, modern architecture, and tastefully decorated interiors. Yet, beneath the surface of her orderly life, there lay a void she couldn't quite fill. Enter Daniel, a 25-year-old artist with a charm that was impossible to ignore. He moved into the guest house in Skylar's backyard, renting the space while he worked on his latest series of paintings. Skylar had initially been hesitant about having a tenant, especially one so much younger and from such a different world. But Daniel's references were impeccable, and there was something about his passion for art that intrigued her. Daniel was a whirlwind of creativity and energy, his presence a stark contrast to Skylar's structured existence. He spent his days covered in paint, creating vibrant, emotionally charged pieces that seemed to pulse with life. Skylar found herself drawn to his studio more often than she cared to admit, initially under the guise of checking if he needed anything, but increasingly because she craved the vitality he exuded. Their interaction started innocently enough. Skylar would bring Daniel coffee, and they'd chat about his work. She admired his dedication and the way he saw the world, so different from her own perspective. Daniel, in turn, was fascinated by Skylar's discipline and the sharp mind behind her composed exterior. He sensed a depth of emotion in her that she kept tightly controlled, and he longed to uncover it. One evening, Skylar found herself at Daniel's door, a bottle of wine in hand. It had been a particularly stressful day at work, and she needed a distraction. Daniel welcomed her with a warm smile, and they sat together in his cluttered studio, surrounded by his unfinished canvases. As the night wore on, the wine flowed, and their conversation grew more personal. Skylar spoke of her frustrations, her loneliness, and the pressures of maintaining her image. Daniel listened intently, offering a sympathetic ear and a fresh perspective. He talked about his struggles as an artist, the fear of failure, and the exhilaration of creation. Without realizing it, they had moved closer to each other. Skylar could feel the heat of Daniel's body, and her heart raced in a way it hadn't in years. When he reached out to touch her hand, she didn't pull away. Instead, she felt a surge of emotion so powerful it took her breath away. That night marked the beginning of their affair. It was passionate and all-consuming, a release for both of them from their respective cages. Skylar felt alive in Daniel's arms, experiencing a freedom she hadn't known she craved. Daniel, in turn, was intoxicated by her intelligence, her strength, and the vulnerability she revealed only to him. But their relationship was fraught with complications. Skylar was acutely aware of the moral and ethical dilemmas it posed. She was significantly older, in a position of authority as his landlord, and more importantly, she was married. Her husband, Mark, was often away on business, and while their marriage had long since lost its spark, he trusted her implicitly. Skylar struggled with guilt, torn between her duty and her desires. She knew that what she was doing was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to end it. The secrecy only heightened the thrill, and she found herself living for the stolen moments she spent with Daniel. Daniel, on the other hand, was less conflicted. He was young and idealistic, and he believed that their love justified the risks they were taking. He saw Skylar as his muse, his inspiration, and he poured his emotions into his art. But as their affair deepened, he began to crave more. He wanted a future with her, a life where they didn't have to hide. The turning point came when Mark returned home unexpectedly one weekend. Skylar had thought he was on a business trip, and she had spent the afternoon in Daniel's arms. When she heard the sound of Mark's car in the driveway, panic seized her. She barely had time to throw on her clothes and compose herself before Mark walked in. The next few days were a blur of tension and deceit. Skylar was terrified that Mark would discover her secret, and she could hardly face Daniel, knowing how close they had come to being caught. But the fear also made her realize how much she had to lose. She couldn't continue living this double life. Skylar decided to end the affair. She met Daniel in his studio, her heart heavy with the decision. As she explained her reasons, tears streamed down her face. Daniel listened in silence, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. He understood, but it didn't make it any easier. For weeks, Skylar avoided Daniel, throwing herself into her work and her marriage. She tried to rekindle the connection with Mark, but it felt forced and hollow. She couldn't stop thinking about Daniel, about what they had shared and what she had given up. Then came the betrayal. Skylar discovered that Mark had been having an affair of his own with a colleague from work. The revelation shattered her. All the guilt and sacrifice seemed meaningless in the face of Mark's deceit. She confronted him, and their marriage fell apart in a blaze of accusations and anger. In the aftermath, Skylar felt adrift. Her life, once so controlled and orderly, was in shambles. She turned to the one person who had always been there for her, who had seen her for who she truly was. She went to Daniel, seeking comfort and solace. Daniel welcomed her with open arms, but things were different now. The trust between them had been fractured, and they both carried the scars of their choices. They tried to rebuild what they had, but it was a slow and painful process. Skylar decided to take a leave of absence from work. She needed time to heal, to figure out what she wanted from her life. She spent her days with Daniel, helping him in his studio, finding peace in the creative process. Slowly, they began to find their rhythm again. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Skylar looked at Daniel and realized how much she had grown to love him. It wasn't just the passion or the excitement, it was deeper than that. Daniel had become her confidant, her partner, and her muse. She reached out to take his hand, and he looked at her with a question in his eyes. Skylar smiled, feeling a sense of clarity she hadn't had in a long time. "I love you, Daniel," she said softly, "and I want to build a life with you." Daniel's face lit up with joy, and he pulled her into his arms. They knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges and obstacles ahead. But for the first time, Skylar felt hopeful about the future. They decided to move away from Westbridge, to start fresh in a new place where they could be themselves without the weight of the past hanging over them. They found a small town by the sea, a place where they could live simply and focus on their art and their love. As they settled into their new life, Skylar and Daniel discovered a sense of peace and fulfillment they had never known before. Their relationship was no longer a secret, and they could be open about their love. They spent their days working side by side, creating art that reflected their journey and their emotions. Skylar continued to struggle with the memories of her past and the choices she had made. But she also found strength in the lessons she had learned. She had discovered the importance of authenticity, of living true to oneself. She had learned that love was not always easy, but it was worth fighting for. In the end, Skylar and Daniel's story was one of redemption and transformation. They had both made mistakes and faced the consequences, but they had also found each other and created something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. As they stood together on the beach, watching the sunset, Skylar felt a sense of contentment she had never known before. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she also knew they would face them together. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. Their love had been tested and had endured, growing stronger with each trial. Skylar and Daniel had found their way back to each other, and they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. And in that, they found their happily ever after. However, life had a way of throwing curveballs. As they settled into their new home, Daniel received an opportunity of a lifetime. A renowned art gallery in New York wanted to showcase his work. It was a dream come true for him, but it meant long periods away from Skylar. Daniel was torn. He didn't want to leave Skylar, but he couldn't pass up this chance. Skylar, seeing the turmoil in his eyes, encouraged him to go. She knew how much this meant to him and assured him that their love was strong enough to withstand the distance. Daniel moved to New York temporarily, promising to visit as often as he could. They kept in touch through daily phone calls and video chats, but as time passed, the distance began to take its toll. Skylar missed Daniel terribly, and their conversations, once filled with laughter and love, became strained. During one of his visits, Skylar noticed a change in Daniel. He seemed distant, preoccupied. When she confronted him, he admitted that he had met someone at the gallery. Her name was Emily, a fellow artist. They had become close, and Daniel was struggling with his feelings. Skylar was devastated. She had encouraged him to follow his dreams, but she hadn't expected this. She felt betrayed, yet she couldn't bring herself to blame Daniel entirely. She knew the pressures he was under, the loneliness he must have felt in a new city. Despite the pain, Skylar decided to give Daniel the space he needed to figure things out. She threw herself into her own work, trying to keep busy. She rekindled old friendships and even took up painting, finding solace in the creative process that had once been Daniel's domain. Months passed, and Daniel's visits became less frequent. Skylar feared the worst, but she held on to the hope that their love would prevail. One day, she received a letter from Daniel. It was heartfelt and sincere, expressing his regret for the distance that had grown between them. He admitted his feelings for Emily, but assured Skylar that she was his true love. He wanted to come back, to make things right. Skylar was conflicted. She loved Daniel, but she wasn't sure if she could trust him again. She decided to meet him in New York to talk things through. When she arrived, she found Daniel waiting for her, looking as nervous as she felt. They spent hours talking, walking through Central Park, and visiting the gallery where Daniel's work was displayed. Skylar could see the connection between Daniel and Emily, but she also saw the love in Daniel's eyes when he looked at her. It was a difficult decision, but Skylar knew she had to follow her heart. She decided to forgive Daniel, to give their love another chance. They agreed to move forward, to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honesty and trust. Daniel finished his commitment in New York, and they returned to their seaside home together. The road to recovery was not easy. Skylar and Daniel attended couples therapy, worked on their communication, and made a conscious effort to spend quality time together. They rediscovered the passion and connection that had first brought them together. Skylar's newfound interest in painting blossomed, and she began showcasing her work alongside Daniel's. Their art became a reflection of their journey, filled with the highs and lows of their relationship. They found healing in their shared creativity, and their bond grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as they stood together on the beach, watching the sunset, Skylar felt a sense of peace and fulfillment. She knew their love had been tested and had endured. They had faced challenges, made mistakes, and hurt each other, but they had also grown and transformed. Skylar turned to Daniel, smiling as she held his hand. "We've been through so much," she said softly, "but I wouldn't trade any of it. It's made us who we are." Daniel squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with love. "I feel the same way. Our journey hasn't been easy, but it's brought us here to this moment, and I wouldn't change a thing." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Skylar and Daniel stood together, their hearts intertwined. They knew there would be more challenges ahead, but they also knew they would face them side by side. And in that certainty, they found their happily ever after, not as an end, but as a new beginning.